Hello, is anybody on the telephone line? Testing 1, 2. Can everyone hear me? Be sure to unmute your mic.
Hi, this is Ken. Can you hear me?
Hello, this is Robert. How are you?
Oh, Robert. Hey, thank you so much for helping. I know these I don't know, this would be tricky for me, so I appreciate you guys managing this.
Hey, no problem. Joe got us all going here. We have our 3 consultants, and driving the WebEx right now is Rich. Rich, why don't you go ahead and say hi?
Good afternoon.
We also have.
Oh, hi, Rich.
Oh.
We also have Sean, who's also going to serve the team today.
Hi, good afternoon.
And finally, we have Francisco.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Francisco. So I'm going to have, I think, 3 other people join from PG&E. It would be Vincent Lowe, Yumi and Tessa Karlberg. So I forwarded them the link you sent me, which seemed to work, which is just the standard attendee list. Do you upgrade us into panelists when appropriate, or how do we manage that?
So the way it's going to work is that Joe had sent out an email, and they have a link in the email. If somehow they join and they don't have automatically join as a panelist, we will upgrade them into the panelist. So as people join, we'll see their names, and we'll just make them a panelist.
Okay, yeah, I see Vincent Lowe in the attendee list. So I tried, just for some reason, I tried joining through the panelist link that was sent, and I kept getting CAPTCHA because I kept entering, it kept finding my email was not a part of the list or associated as a panelist. So that's what happened there. So no big deal. I forwarded your link to the couple other panelists that should show up. And again, that's Vincent Lowe, Yumi O-U-M, and Tessa Karlberg.
Awesome.
Okay, I'm online. I just been unmuted, but thank you.
I'm sorry, who's your name again?
I'm Vincent.
Welcome, Vincent. This is Robert Stanford from the CPUC.
Thank you.
Awesome. So, Robert, I think once we start, I believe Steve will probably have an initial statement or two, and if he doesn't, I can take it. I think we're on slide 33 is where we'll start, which is the cross-cutting factors, and generally where we left last time. So, just as an FYI.
Yumi's going to be joining too, but she will want to drive the presentation at some point in time as well.
Okay.
So if we have somebody outside our room here in the auditorium in San Francisco driving, they just need to tell Rich, next slide or previous slide. Pretty easy.
Well, I think she wants to. She's going to show some stuff that's not in this presentation. Like, for example, with one of the slides, she wants to show the PowerPoint animation. So you might not be able to do that because you have a PDF file, and then she wants to show an Excel spreadsheet and show the cells in the spreadsheet. So she's going to have to take control of the screen.
Absolutely, Vincent. And when it's time for her to do this, we'll just go ahead and make her a presenter.
Okay.
And I do see that Yumi has joined in the regular attendee group.
Got it. We'll make her part of the panelist team. Thank you.
Wonderful. No, thank you. I really appreciate you guys organizing this.
We're doing our best. Actually, these guys are the ones driving it. I'm just in the narrator.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. This is Robert.
Great.
PUC.
Hi, Robert.
Hi. How do you pronounce your last name, ma'am? Very good. I understand you have a presentation today. So when it comes time, we will make you, we'll pass the ball or make you presenter.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert, I see our other panelist, Tessa Carlberg, has joined, and if you have the ability to promote her, that would be wonderful.
Roger that.
Can you all hear me?
Yes,
Yes, I
you're
can.
loud. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I would just like to do a quick speaker check, mic check. Peter, can you hear me? I know you don't have the ability to respond, but if you could just send me a quick message, an email or IM, that'd be great. Robert, since Yumi is on, do you think she can go ahead and take the ball? I think she'll drive right off the bat and probably just hold it throughout the rest of the workshop.
Roger that.
just to make sure people on the line are aware, this starts at 1 o'clock. There is a dead silence right now as we wait.
Sorry about that, Ken. I would have brought my my audio track.
Oh, no worries, no worries. I invited people a little bit early, so there could be some questions on the line about, if they're missing something. So I think that's on my side.
Got it. Do you have would you happen to have a agenda that we could follow?
The agenda is just going to be a continuation of what we did, I think, 2 Mondays ago. And in my mind, it's 3 bullet points. It's talking about the crosscutters, section 6, which is the slide Yumi has up. We'll talk about the ramp work papers, which is the following section. And then we had a little bit of a change of pace on the second workshop, so just making sure people are aware of workshop number 2, which is on July 30th, so for the full day. So those are the 3 items I think we'll be covering today.
Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
Hello, this is Wendy Al-Mcdad. Can you hear me?
Hi, Wendy. This is Ken from PG&E. I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay. I asked to be in the panelist, and I just want to ask, the work papers, you mean the modeling work papers for agenda?
I do. Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Wendy. This is Robert Stanford, CPUC. Welcome.
Thank you, Robert.
Hey, Robert. Okay. Hey, Robert. So you have the file pulled up. Okay, good. I emailed Joe Hager the file, so you have it. So it doesn't matter now. Okay, good.
No problem.
Let's see. This workshop should be recorded, just so we have that set correctly.
Affirmative. Your workshop is being recorded.
Is that the in the top bar of WebEx is where it says connected? I assume that red dot means we are being recorded. All right.
Yes, sir.
Great.
Hey, Robert, I need to talk to you about how to get hold of that recording from the July 14th workshop.
Will do. I'll go ahead and make a note of it, and as soon as I get an opportunity, I will send that to you.
Okay, good. Hey, Wendy, remind me for the 2:30 break. So in case we run long, it's up to you to remind me that you want to take that break.
Yes, I will. Just to let everybody know, I was asking Steve beforehand that if we're going longer than an hour and a half, I really need for us to take a 10-minute break. Today's our Friday prayers.
Absolutely. It is 1 o'clock. Steve, did you want to kick us off?
Let's wait a couple more minutes for people to dial in.
Okay.
Hey, Robert, how can I tell how many participants there are right now? Oh, 38. I see it now. 38. 39. 40. 41. 42.
This is Tom. While we're waiting, first, can folks hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. And then second, could we do a sound check for Jonathan Lesser? Jonathan, could you speak to see if we can hear you?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's perfect. Yes. Thank you.
Is Chuck Feinstein joining us today?
He should be.
Okay.
I do see him on the attendee list, but he is not in the panel section.
Oh, thank you, Ken. I'll send him a text.
I think Robert can just lift him up.
Oh, okay.
It should be Robert, if you have a chance, yeah. Charles Feinstein in the attendee group.
Will do.
Or the participant group, yeah. There he is.
Give it one more minute.
Hello, gentlemen. Charles Feinstein is now a panelist.
Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Feinstein, this is Robert Stanford from the CPUC. Can we do a sound check?
Okay, with 50 participants, 51. Okay. All right, let's get started. My name is Steve Hain, and I'm Senior Utilities Engineer from the Safety Policy Division. This is a PG&E RAM workshop. This is the continuation of PG&E's RAM workshop, post-filing RAM workshop number 1. We had a post-filing RAM workshop number 1 on July 14th. However, that went long with all the good questions that the interveners and participants had, and the vigorous discussions that resulted from those questions. And we agreed at the July 14th workshop that we'll pick up from where we left off last time, which is the cross-cutting factors, and that we did not touch last time. We also agreed to devote a second post-filing workshop that I would call that post-filing workshop number 2, and that would take place on July 30th. Is it July 30th? Is it 31st or 30th? Oh, 30th, okay. And I already sent out an invitation. If you didn't get that, send me an email. I will send it to you. That workshop will be devoted entirely to the wildfire risk. And I will also take some time during the course of this workshop to discuss the possibility of a third post-filing workshop for PG&E to talk about the other risks besides wildfire risk. So that's something we need to talk about later on. Let's see. We have a very limited number of panelist spots. As a panelist, it is expected that you mute your mic when you're not talking. That way you'll minimize all the background noises that will show up. And another item of discussion is we'll have a 10-minute break at the 2:30 mark. So 2:30, we'll have a 10-minute break. And that's about it. And with me today are PG&E representatives represented by Ken Arnold. He is the case manager for this RAM proceeding. He's joined by Yumi sorry if I mispronounced that name, and also Vincent Lowe. And also on the panel are TURN representatives, Jonathan Lesser, Charles Feinstein, and Tom Long. And also Wendy Elmcdott from my team is also on the panel. As I stated before, there are a very limited number of panelist spots. If you feel that your frequent questions justify you being elevated from being a participant to a panelist position, send me a private email. I will consider that depending on your level of participation and the discussion being considered. So without further ado, let me introduce you, hand the mic, so to speak, to Ken Arnold. Ken?
Thank you, Steve. I think you covered a lot of things I was going to go over. I think we should just take a minute for a safety message. The safety message, very similar to, I think, 2 Mondays ago, COVID-19.ca.gov is an incredible resource to learn and know more about the current pandemic and what is going on in our society. There's a ton of data and metrics. There's also very important information about how to maintain your mental health with our current environment. Social distancing isn't social isolation. Making sure that you reach out and are talking to people virtually and you have that communication is very important. It also talks about making sure that you get the right amount of exercise and nutrition and just look after yourself. So just a reminder for everyone here that's working remotely and is, I think, hopefully doing a great job of social distancing and trying to mitigate the virus. Just keep that in mind. So with that said, Steve, as you said, the PG&E panel today will be Vincent Lowe and Yumi as the primary presenters. My name is Ken Arnold. I'm the regulatory case manager for the RAMP case, and with me as a panelist as well is Tessa Carlberg, the lead attorney for the case. So with that said, our agenda today to finish the deck from July 14th, Yumi will be starting, I think we will be going back to starting at the cross-cutting factors section. We'll be going to that. Our request and how we would like to manage questions and comments is to pause after each slide. I will be monitoring all of the Q&A online, and that's when I will step in to ask those questions for people who are typing them in. And then for panelists and other people who can speak, again, we just like to give the presenters an opportunity to get through the full slide before the questions start. So with that said, I'll pause. I'll ask if anyone has any questions, panelists or participants. I'll look in the Q&A if there are, and if there aren't, in about 15 seconds, Yumi, I'll turn it over to you to begin.
Ken, before we start, should we see if there are any decision makers online?
Oh, thank you. That is absolutely one of my responsibilities. Similar to the last workshop, it is PG&E is very interested to make sure that there are no decision makers on the line. If there are, we just need you to identify yourself so we can properly report that up our channels for disclosure and transparency. So in the same token, while I wait for questions or feedback from the panelists or participants, if any decision makers can identify yourself at this window, that would be great. Okay, hearing none.
Ken, can I? Oh, sorry. I just want to mention one thing. People might not, we're all learning. When you type into the Q&A or chat, you just might want to choose to send it to all participants or something like that if you want, right?
You know, that's really good to mention, Wendy. You, as a participant, you have the ability to send it to whoever you want. I think the options are like host and presenter, myself, to everybody. My suggestion would be to send it to the host and the presenter, which would be, I think Robert will manage on that side, or you can also send them to me, Ken Arnold, as well, and I will make sure that the questions get asked. Did that meet your question, Wendy? Is that what you're looking for?
I appreciate, I have a different preference. I kind of prefer to have people send it to all attendees so people see what, kind of stirs other thoughts too. But, either way, it's up to people to do it. I just wanted to make a note. Sometimes it's not obvious what you're doing. Absolutely fair.
I think it's good if you you want your question to be seen by everybody, that's fine. Obviously, it'll be asked and it will be out in the open. But Wendy, I hear you. Having, you know, being able to see that and spurring thought and conversation is why we're here today. So understood. I'll just pause because I think I heard a couple other things. I see Tom raising his hand. Go ahead, Tom.
That's right, Ken. Just on the decision maker participation, I don't want to take a long time on this, but I'm a little unclear about why we would be concerned with decision makers participating. I would welcome decision makers participating in this workshop, and it's been a noticed workshop, so I'm not sure there's any ex parte issue.
We're certainly not concerned. We're absolutely interested in as much participation as we can, but our own internal policies require us to know when we're working with decision makers. This is a transparency thing. It has nothing, we would not exclude anyone here, Tom. Just want to be very clear about that. We just want to make sure that we're open about who's here today.
Okay, I think maybe you misspoke when you were introducing this earlier, but
very possible. It is Friday. It is 1 o'clock. That will probably happen again. But just to be very clear, yes, no, we welcome all participation and comments, and we're here today to work with people. So we just want to be, again, meeting our own internal standards of transparency.
Okay, thank you, Ken.
You're welcome. All right. Is there any other questions? Now would be the time. Yumi, I think you can go ahead and start. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Ken. Can you all see my screen movement? Okay.
Yes, we can see.
Great. So in the next 4 slides, starting from here, 1, 2, 3, 4, I will explain how we approach the cross-cutting factors in this RAMP report. It's a bit complicated in how we did it, so I want to make sure that it's easy. I mean, you guys can understand better by us going through this slide deck. And if you have questions, just let me know. So the cross-cutting factors are in PG&E's definition. It's not risk events in and out of themselves, but and also it's not in risk event in our corporate risk register. But typically, those factors impact multiple risks across multiple lines of business. And this visual may be able to explain how they show up in our bow ties in a high level. Let's say we have 2 risk events. One cross-cutting factor could show up in like 2 different risks. In fact, it could show up in many different risks as a driver. One particular risk could have multiple cross-cutting factor drivers represented. Cross-cutting factors can also impact the consequence of multiple risk events or a particular event, either show up as maybe outcomes or maybe showing up as something that impacts the consequence of existing events. The cross-cutting programs that address this or try to reduce the impact of cross-cutting factor are managed usually by separate lines of business that's different from the risk event lines of business. And their effectiveness in reducing the risk associated with the cross-cutting factors as maybe reducing the likelihood of these risk events or the consequence of these risk events are actually addressed in many of the trenches of multiple risks. It could be affecting different drivers differently if cross-cutting factor mitigations impact different drivers. So in the end, what we have done is that we represented cross-cutting factors in each of the bow ties and also modeled the impact of that cross-cutting programs in reducing those impacts. And we aggregated risk reductions coming from cross-cutting programs across multiple risks, calculated RSE for that cross-cutting program as a whole. So in trying to
excuse me, I have a question.
Sure.
I had a question on the previous slide. The text of the second bullet says one RSE is calculated per cross-cutting factor. Does that mean that there's a separate RSE calculated for cross-cutting factors?
So let's say if we have cyber attack as one cross-cutting factor, and there could be many mitigations that reduce its cyber factor impacts in different risk events. But instead of modeling like each of the cyber programs, RSEs separately, we calculate just one RSE for cyber program as a whole. Right, but there is different RSE for the programs for different cross-cutting factors.
So to understand that example you just gave, cyber is a cross-cutting factor. It's not a separate risk. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
And so you're going to have a program to perhaps mitigate some of the either the likelihoods or consequences of the cyber cross-cutting factor. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to calculate an RSE for the effect that will help us understand the effectiveness of those programs that are designed to mitigate the impact of cyber issues on either likelihood or consequence.
Mm-hmm.
So there'll be a single RSE that will be separately calculated for this cyber cross-cutting factor.
Yes.
Okay.
In a way, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So this lists 8 cross-cutting factors that we included in our RAMP report, starting from climate change, cyber attack that we talked about, emergency preparedness and response, that's what we call EPNR, IT, asset failure, physical attack, records and information management, which we call RIM, seismic, as well as the skilled and qualified workforce. So for each of these cross-cutting factors, what we have done is that we went ahead with assessing the impact of each cross-cutting factor for each of our 12 RAMP risks and see whether it impacts the likelihood of that risk event or the consequence of the risk event or both. So this shows a summary of what we have assessed, but in this dots, there are like 12 dots in a way for each of the risks. Some risk might be only affected by on the risk likelihood. Some risks might have a consequence, but then overall, this climate change affects the likelihood of a risk event or the consequence. So once we assess whether it impacts the likelihood or the consequence for each of these, the next step was to figure out, okay, how we are going to be including that impact in the both sides of each risk event. So in the end, there were many different ways that we incorporated cross-cutting factors in the model. So let me, it's too many text, maybe too many ways, but let me just go through one by one and explain in more detail. So starting from number 1 here, a driver of a risk event. There were 2 cases in this category. One is what we called extracted from existing, which is the case when there were historical events with that cross-cutting factor as a driver of the event. Example is like physical attack driver for employee safety events, safety incident risk, where historical data set used to quantify this risk had already instances resulting from a physical attack. So in that case, we just identify those events as physical attack driver and calculated or associated the likelihood of those events happening from that physical attack driver. The other case is here what we called as added frequency. This is the case when there is no historical event associated with this cross-cutting factor in the historical data set we used, but such an event could happen, and we determined that it would make sense to include the likelihood of the risk event happening from that cross-cutting driver. An example would be the seismic scenarios that we represented as earthquakes of a magnitude of 7.0 or higher in Bay Area. That has significant probability of happening, but it didn't happen in the data set that we used to quantify this risk. So to reflect such scenarios in, for example, asset failure risk, we added the expected frequency of asset failures from such seismic scenarios in the frequency of asset failures obtained from historical data. And it's going to show up as a separate driver in the bow tie. So that's the driver number one. Number two is as a consequence multiplier. So this is the case where cross-cutting factor increases the consequence when the event happens. So it doesn't impact the likelihood of event, but when the risky event happens, the impact is impact does not already account for that cross-cutting factor impact. So we basically explicitly add on top of what was quantified already in the consequence, so that this impact will be, the cross-cutting impact can be added and accounted in the consequence of the risk event. An example would be record and information management. For all of our risks to represent some financial consequence associated with identifying and producing the records after a risk event. And we would expect that the cost will be higher after a larger event. So the multiplier is used to reflect the higher cost associated with these records depending on the consequence of the event. And that's included in the consequence. I can explain in more detail in the examples later on. Number three is the outcome case. This is a separate outcome. So this is the case when cross-cutting factor does not impact the likelihood again, but it impacts the consequence. And the consequence is different from the other consequence. So the consequence is different when the cross-cutting event happens at the same time. So for example, cyber attack as an example. So cyber attack impacts, let's say here, in the gas SCADA system during a large overpressurization event. The cyber attack, the team has assessed that cyber attack would not cause the event to happen, but then when the event happens, if the overpressurization event happens and the cyber attack happens at the same time, then it could amplify the consequence of the risky event because we have reduced the ability to see the event or have less control into the system. So what will be our response to the event will be delayed or so that the consequence will be more severe. So the outcome, separate outcome was used to represent more severe consequence of cross-cutting factor outcomes when the risk event happens. So number four is combination of the driver and outcome. So which is called unique driver outcome combination. This was used when cross-cutting factor is a driver of the risk event, like number one here. And the consequence of the event when this event happens from this cross-cutting driver is distinct from the outcomes that's happening from the other drivers. For example, like we talked about the seismic driver for asset failures, and we anticipate that the asset failures resulting from a big seismic event would be more severe than the consequence from routine asset failures for many reasons. So we added a separate outcome to represent more severe outcomes associated with the seismic driver. So in that case, we called it unique driver and outcome combination, and you will see an example in the next slide. Number five is escalating frequency. So this is the case where the cross-cutting factor affects the frequency of the risky event for a particular subdriver or outcome. But then that impact would change over time. So right now, let's say the impact is 1, let's say, but then over time, it could be increasing. So an example will be obviously the climate change. That's how we reflected the impact of climate change cross-cutting factor in some of our risks, for example, wildfire, where we escalated the frequency of ignitions that occur during, let's say, red flag warning outcomes over time to reflect a higher likelihood of resulting in more severe outcomes than the historical data. So that's the escalating frequency category. Number 6 is embedded. So this is the case where we determined that the impact of a cross-cutting factor is already accounted in the estimated frequency and consequence of the risk event. Example would be EPNR, emergency preparedness and response, where the data set we use to quantify the consequence of the risk event can be assumed to be already including the impact of EPNR or but the performance of the EPNR program as a control. So we didn't explicitly quantify it in the bow tie. However, we tried to incorporate the EPNR mitigation programs in the test year baseline case so that we can incorporate the risk reduction that we can achieve from EPNR mitigation.
Yumi?
So,
Wendy?
Yep.
So for example 5 for this escalating frequency, does this mean that some of these cross-cutting factors you're actually just incorporating into the models for those specific risks, for example, wildfire? So it's not.
Yeah, we are.
Okay, because I was thinking the cross-cutting, what we were covering now was cross-cutting. I think you have cross-cutting chapters or,
Yes.
Those only things that are not included in cross-cutting issues that are not included in other risk areas that you've already covered. I mean, I'm just kind of trying to understand the way PG&E has presented it.
Yeah, so cross-cutting chapter, I think chapter 20, that is presenting how we incorporate cross-cutting factors in each of the risk chapters. So the way that it's incorporated in each of the cross-cutting chapters may overlap each other. So we consolidate it in one chapter and describe as a whole. But each individual risk chapter mentions which cross-cutting factors are affecting their risk. Does that explain?
Yeah, thank you. I haven't read chapter 20, so that's.
Yeah, chapter 20 and attachment to chapter 20 will more detailed explain this, what I'm explaining here. Tom? Oh, you're mute. You're muted, Tom.
Thank you. I'm having a little trouble understanding the consequence multiplier, how that, the example that's given, a record and information management related costs, I think you were saying would happen after a loss of containment event.
Yeah.
That there'd be a desire to follow up and get records that related to the event. That was the example?
Yes.
So that's increased costs to the utility because the regulators want to see the records.
Yeah, and then there is a whole discovery process about finding the cause and the records associated with the events.
Okay. Are there any other examples?
Yeah.
Of how cross-cutting factors?
Well, GREAM was as a whole included in all of our risks as so I think it was included 9 or 10 risks where there is financial consequence. So we decided to apply all of our risks because any of the risk event could have potentially cost associated with the records. And if each organization's record management practice is not mature enough, then the cost associated with identifying records or producing the records after the event will be more severe. So we made that the impact on the financial consequence to be more severe for the organization that has less maturity on the record management. So that if they improve as a mitigation on the record management side, their maturity of record management, then it's gonna show up as the reduced financial consequence when the event happens.
Could I ask whether RIM was also fits in some of these other categories as a driver or any of these other categories?
Yes. Yes. So for the risks that determined that there were actually events in historical data that was driven by the RIM. For example, we had, I think, a couple of examples that we could pull out from the historical data, so extracted from existing, that event was associated with the record and information management driver. So in that case, that RIM was categorized as a driver. So it could be both.
Right. Okay. And there's a very well-known one, the San Bruno explosion. Is.
Yes. So for that risk, it's separate driver.
Okay. Thank you.
You mean there's a question? I'm gonna jump in and read William Abrams' question. What differentiates cross-cutting factors from compound risks? Is PG&E equating external risks to cross-cutting factors? If these factors drive consequence multipliers, then does that lead to risk multipliers and perhaps represent them as such?
So,
yeah, I'd like to understand a little bit more by what's meant by compound risk. But as you can see by some of the factors that we have, they're not entirely all external risk. RIM is a risk. It's not external to PG&E, but it shows up both as a consequence multiplier and, as we just talked about, it's also a driver for some of our risk. So it's not exclusively a risk multiplier, if I understand the term correctly.
Okay, so let me show you in the next slide about the examples in the failure of distribution overhead asset risk for type and how it shows up. And this risk particularly has probably as many as cross-cutting factors models. That's why we took this as an example. So let me start from the left-hand side in here. On the left-hand side, a natural hazard driver for failure of distribution overhead asset failure events. Natural hazard, there are multiple sub-drivers in here that explains different kinds of sub-drivers, that categories of this natural hazard driver. For each of those sub-drivers, our climate team have assessed how the climate change will impact the frequency of those each sub-driver driven failures over time. And so there is a separate a curve that would multiply this historical baseline and changes that over time into the future through escalating frequency method. The three sub-drivers or drivers here represent a case where we extracted from existing, where physical attack or skilled and qualified workforce or RIM. You see we have really a lot of risk events for this particular risk. So out of those events, I think more than 5 years of worth of historical data, we have identified actually how many of them are actually driven by physical attack, how many were actually driven by lack of skilled qualified workforce, and how many were actually driven by some record-related issues. And so we identified those and assigned the frequency or likelihood of those events happening as a separate driver. And then on the right-hand side, you see we basically identified, showed here that the RIM was modeled as consequence multiplier. So this core value, in fact, reflects some component of it is RIM related. Some component of these core values are the other consequence coming from the event. And then this one is the outcome. And you see that this outcome is asset failure, not associated with ignition, but coincided with IT asset failure. And this one is IT asset failure cross-cutting factor. The team has determined that IT asset failure is not a driver for this risk event. But then when IT asset failure happens at the same time when this risk event happens, then the consequence of this asset failure, the distribution overhead asset failure, will be more severe than routine asset failure. You can see from the core value in here, 0.12, that is about 6 times higher than the core values, 6 times higher of the core values when asset failure happens without the IT asset failure happening, or the frequency of that is really small. So that is why we separate out as a separate outcome to reflect, okay, when there is IT asset failure, the consequence of the distribution overhead asset failure could be more severe. The other,
this is Wendy. Wendy, I have a question. So does this assume, and this probably goes to all of the bow ties, does this assume that only one driver can be the cause of an outcome, or can it be a combination of drivers?
So all of our bow tie, it looks as if all of these drivers lead to all of these outcomes, but in the behind the scenes, if you look at the input file, there is a separate probability of leading into this outcome from different drivers. So meaning that, let me take maybe this example. So seismic scenario driver will only lead to this seismic scenario related outcome. So the frequency associated with this seismic scenario driver in leading into the rest of the outcomes will be 0 in the input file. So that this is only associated with this. But the other drivers, let's say the rest of, let's say, except for the seismic driver, the rest of it will lead into all of these outcomes, right? So that's separately represented in the input file. So it depends on the case.
Okay, so it sounds like there are certain ones that only lead to a certain outcome in your modeling, but there are, is it often that you have cases where you have in the input file multiple drivers leading to an outcome?
Yes, so here you can see that asset failure, not coincident, this is the first one. It will have all of these drivers, except for seismic, will lead into this outcome.
So I guess my question is, could they happen at the same time? Can more than one driver happen at the same time? Let me clarify.
So
I'm asking that because, go ahead. Just go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I see where you're getting. So most of our events are associated probably one leading driver. So when we represented our bow tie and tried to quantify the frequency of the event happening from a particular driver, we assume that there is one leading driver and we associate that frequency to that driver. But we know that there are cases where there could be multiple causes of the event, right? So for example, a motor vehicle incident could be driven by contribution from like multiple factors, like fatigue or like disruption, and all of those could impact one event. That one we are trying to figure out how we could incorporate that. I think we didn't do that this time.
Okay, thank you. I bring that up because when I did root cause analysis training 4 years ago, they really emphasized in that root cause analysis training that many events have multiple drivers, you know, that happen together.
Yep.
So it's just.
That's right.
Either at the same time or they because they all happen, that's why the outcome.
Yes, that's a really good point. That's something that we are trying to figure out as well. But then one way we try to incorporate those factors is that, let's say we have a avoidance mitigation that addresses equipment failure driver, but then we look at the other drivers and see whether some of the other driver event could be actually reduced from that mitigation. And so we try to incorporate, like one mitigation could actually address multiple drivers. And maybe that's a little bit we can incorporate multiple cause of the event, but I recognize that there is some room to improve on how to handle those situations. So that's the end of my cross-cutting factor slide. And after Vince, yep.
This is Chris Parks. Hey, I wanted to ask you a question about cross-cutting risks. I was going to ask, how does PG&E regionalize risks? For example, you know, cross-cutting seismic risk and overhead distribution failure risk will vary by location. And I was curious how PG&E regionalizes. I don't know if that's a word, but how would they regionalize or factor in that, factor in the regional aspects of risk?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So this round, we tried to identify the risk associated with a particular big seismic scenarios that we included. So for example, as I explained earlier, the seismic scenario that we represented here in all of our risk chapters are associated with the Bay Area specific seismic events and the probability of those events happening. That would not apply to the rest of the service territory, but only like this San Francisco Bay Area. Probably the way to go, over that is we have separate trenches for Bay Area and have them to have higher risk associated with seismic driver than the rest of the trenches that's separate out from the Bay Area, if that becomes really important to model separately. So there is a way that we can do through creating these bow ties for different trenches differently and associating different frequencies with the seismic driver.
Thank you. And so does PG&E do that for each of these different risks?
We have done, we didn't do that for seismic this round, but we have done it for the other drivers if different regions would have different frequency associated with the driver.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the cross-cutting factors?
I have a question. This is Charles Feinstein. I wonder if last time you said, I believe, that no outcome can occur without a driver. And I believe you also said that every driver can possibly be associated with multiple outcomes. And I believe you also said that every outcome can be associated with multiple drivers. And that's all for a single bow tie with a single risk event.
Yep.
Is the issue here that a cross-cutting factor can influence either in the likelihood side or the consequence side more than one risk event?
Well, what do you mean by the issue?
Why you're developing, the issue is you're developing a structure, or you've labeled something called a cross-cutting factor. You said that there are 6 different ways of treating it. What I'm confused by is what the fundamental issue is. And it strikes me that the fundamental issue, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, but it strikes me that the fundamental issue is that a cross-cutting factor can influence more than one risk event.
Yeah, that's right. Or it could be a driver to more than one, a common driver to more than one risk event, like we have
If that's the case, sorry, please.
No, that's what I have to say.
If that's the case, then the cross-cutting factor appears in more than one bow tie.
Yes, that's correct. In chapter 20, we show which cross-cutters affect which bow ties.
Thank you.
Yumi, there's a question from FEITA, Bureau of Excellence. Does PG&E work with local USGS offices to understand the seismic risks?
We have seismic geoscience team who is working for the enterprise to assess the seismic risk.
To Peter, if I got that right. I have sent out a quick question to see if I can answer, and if I do, I will let you know. I think the seismic team is probably the one to confirm that.
Any other questions on the cross-cutting factor? Okay.
If we could just pause really quick, Yumi, I want to answer a question from William Abrams. The format of the workshop, William, is that there can only be so many panelists with an open mic to talk. So I think you'd have to contact Steve, who's running the workshop, to see if he has the availability to make you a panelist, if that's what you want. Otherwise, we are asking people to ask questions and respond via the written Q&A. But just to make sure you're clear on what the format is and how we're running the workshop.
Yeah, this is Steve Hain here. There is a raise hand button under the participants panel on the lower right-hand side. I have not used it before. I know that it's a button that you can use to raise your hand and alert the panelists that you're trying to ask a question. Send me an email, private email, if you want to be a panelist. I'll look at it on a case-by-case basis. I don't personally have the ability to grant you panelist status. I will have to rely on my IT guy, Robert Stanford, who's a great help on this, to help me to grant you panelist status or take away from you if you misbehave. So he's the person who can do that. I cannot do that. So I have sent him an email for some people to join as a panelist. So, oh, there you go, William Abrams. Okay, there you go.
Yes, thank you. I think it was fixed, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Good. So it's on a case-by-case basis consideration. Obviously, not everyone can be a panelist because you have an unlimited ability to talk, and that can sometimes be very disruptive. If we have too many panelists on the panel, so we have to keep the numbers small. So if you're not, if you're on a panel and you're not talking, please keep your mic muted.
There was a follow-up question from FEITA, which is on the driver of natural hazards. Did PG&E include the volcanic risk? USGS has identified 7 volcanoes as very high or high risk to population. And again, that may be a question for our seismic team, which I have already sent over. So Yumi, if you don't have an answer, we can attempt to take that one offline.
Yeah, I don't have an answer.
Okay. I will. I think I have your email, and I will work for a response. Okay, I think we can continue.
Okay, let's move to the next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about the lessons that we learned from this RAN filing, and we kind of classified it into broad areas that as we've gained a lot of experience in, and we want to definitely improve on. First one is data quality. I think it's a surprise that if we're moving to a more quantitative framework, the key thing is having the data available to us to help support that framework. So, for example, a next step that we might want to take is to really factor in more of the asset health and other data in coming up with driver probabilities, right? Not just based on historical, but look at the health of the assets as they are. And the next thing I wanted to talk about was also about RSEs. We realized that when we were doing this analysis, RSEs are an important factor, but they shouldn't be an exclusive reason for doing mitigations. So one example that I can think of is the RSEs, as they're supposed to do, they represent the overall, the entire benefits of embarking on a mitigation. And so what that means is that if you have a mitigation that has a long-term benefit, most of the benefits might be back-end loaded. And if you embark on that mitigation, then you might not be reducing your risk in the near term. So that's one of the things that RSEs, because by definition, they should include every benefit. We might not be able to, it doesn't have that component of time in it that might be important for some of the risks that we have. So that's one of the things that we notice about RSEs. Another one is also the problem of translating between units. So if you looked at the previous slide in the previous slide that you can see that the exposure from a risk standpoint was measured in terms of miles. But many times when we do these mitigations, it's not miles that we're talking about, excuse me. It's number of pieces of equipment we want to replace, right? So now we have to convert between, in order to calculate the RSEs for these mitigations, we have to convert between number of pieces of equipment to risk reduction per mile, just as an example. So that conversion, obviously you're gonna end up using some averages. That's something that I think we can do a better job in terms of improving in the next go round. Number 3 I want to talk about is modeling. And one of the things about modeling is that I think we identified maybe last time around, if we had a more kind of expansive set of distributions out there. Right now we have the standard ones, Poisson distributions, log normal, binomial, uniform, discrete distributions, Bernoulli distributions. We have those set of distributions, but we're thinking that in the future we might want to kind of increase the set of distributions that we have so that we can do a better job in terms of representing the data, especially for the tail events. Number 4 I wanted to mention is IT asset failure. In our modeling of the IT cross-cutting risk, and to an extent cyber as well, I think the end result doesn't adequately highlight the critical role that our IT systems play and sufficiently characterize the age asset or asset health of the systems, right? So looking at IT through the lens of a cross-cutting factor, that is in the context of a specific risk event, in terms of the consequence of that risk event or the likelihood of that risk event, is admittedly not giving such as good insight into the IT system health as we would like. So it doesn't present a direct tie to the system's asset health and equipment most likely to fail, and doesn't consider all the data that's being collected from our systems. So this is an area that we realize we have IT asset in 4 of our bow ties, either as a consequence or as a driver. And when we were working through it, we wanted to basically, we were finding that it's not capturing the way we're doing it. It's not adequately capturing or representing the IT risk. So that's one of the areas that we want to improve on in the future. So
can I ask Vincent real quick, when you say IT risk, are you talking about industrial control systems, part of, I mean, intelligent devices out on your electric system and gas systems? I mean, what exactly?
Yeah, SCADA systems, even communication systems. So that's one of the challenges, right? How do you determine which are the systems that affect a particular risk that we're talking about? All these different systems involved with different bow ties. So just identifying what's a critical system is difficult, and understanding how it's critical and the role it plays too is difficult. And so we also haven't figured into the risk, the health of these systems that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you. I just would encourage you to think about calling it something other than just IT, you know, industrial, you know, because it is part of your industrial control system. I don't think, are you also talking about, are you combining this, including PG&E back office, you know, IT systems, or only?
So each of these, well, IT asset failure, we can think about the name, but so for each of these risk, we try to identify the systems that were critical to the risk, right? So they could, if the risk, most of the risks don't have any back office systems that are critical to them. But if, for example, they rely on communications network or satellite communications network or something, then yeah, that would be part of the systems that are critical for that risk. So I don't know if IT industrial control systems are something we'll consider as far as being more descriptive.
Yeah, because I think the control systems, it integrates communications into it. So, or you know, it includes a communications aspect. But anyway, when I first looked at this, I wasn't realizing it was as broad as what you are implying now.
Yeah, I mean, for example, our wildfire emergency operations centers, part of an IT systems that we have too. So that's another example. So take your naming suggestion into consideration.
Vincent,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Vincent, this is Chris Parks. Hey, you just mentioned that IT asset failure hasn't factored in IT asset health yet. And I was curious, has asset health been factored into all of the other assets, or is that something that is that needs further development for other assets?
Yeah, it needs further development for the other assets as well.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to talk next about cross-cutting factors. So what we talk in terms of IT, it's also true to a certain extent of all of the cross-cutting factors, right? So looking at cross-cutters through the lens of risk events, it's been challenging to us because there's often a very limited data to support this particular view. And we've relied on SME judgment in a lot of the cases. So it's a new approach for us, and we also face challenges in terms of coordination and also prioritization and understanding what could be done using this approach. So cross-cutting, admittedly, once again, we can do some improvement in terms of that, especially finding the data. It's really hard to been challenging to look for the data and for this particular risk context that we have for the crosscutters. And then last I wanted to mention was basically granularity of tranches. I think this is an ongoing effort. Will always be an iterative process as we develop a set of tranches for a risk. We always are looking for improvements of where we can improve it, and taking the suggestions that we get and learning from a particular tranche approach, and learning what are the pitfalls and what are the benefits, and revising the tranches. So it's always going to be a evolution as far as tranches are concerned.
Vincent, if you're finished with the slide, this is Tom Long. I have a question.
Yes, please.
About risk spend efficiency. I didn't understand your point where I think you were stating that in your view, risk spend efficiency doesn't take long-term benefits into account, or something along those lines.
No, I think it does. It doesn't take the timing of the benefits into account in the context of, you might have a benefit that has a very long-term effects, right? Like system hardening, but it only achieves the benefit over a period of time. Whereas you might need to reduce your risk like for next year, as opposed to maybe 5 years down the road. So that timing aspect of it is something that the RSEs, right now, it doesn't capture, it's not captured in the RSEs.
Well, but you do use net present value, and that is a way to capture the time value of benefits in the future.
Right, but for example, the benefits could be backloaded, right? If you do a system hardening, might not be in place for next year or the year after, but the benefits are backloaded, but you might need some risk reduction next year and the year after. So that's why it doesn't capture that aspect of it. That definitely does include the net present value.
It definitely doesn't what?
It definitely does include the net present value of the long-term benefits. Sorry about that.
This may just be
back and loaded.
Okay, this may just be a point of disagreement about the usefulness of RSE. Thank you.
So, I have a question about the granular tranches. When you show the bow tie, how exactly are you doing a different model for each tranche with using the bow tie, and when you're running the models?
Yeah, each tranche has its own exposure, right? So the bow tie that you see, that you've seen in the report, they're basically like aggregate bow ties. But if you look in the report, you can find the different tranches and the exposure for each tranches.
Oh, and also each tranche has different probability of risk event or likelihood of risk event, as well as the consequence of the risk event.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Of doing the trend.
So I didn't catch that. You mean?
Yeah, so the idea of the trend is to reflect different probability of risk events as well as the consequence of the risk event when the system doesn't have the like nature of the risk. So we divide it into similar risk profile and then assign different values for likelihood and the consequence of the risk event for each trend.
Okay. Let's see. Maybe this is a good time to talk about the. If there are no other questions, this may be a good time to talk about the work papers.
Okay, so should we take a break or should we just continue?
Well, Yumi, I think we're taking a break at 2:30, so I think it's appropriate to continue. And right about 2:29, we'll make sure we stop.
Okay. So before I show this Excel slide, so we have sent out the modeling work paper package on July 17, which included modeling input file for each of the risk and bowtie output file and source documentation that describes how we obtained those inputs, and then the user guide to be able to interpret or how we modeled and how our risk input file and outputs are structured. So I want to go through or walk through the modeling input file and bowtie output file for easier navigation when you review those files. So where did it go? Okay. So this is the modeling input file or risk input file report. There is one risk input file for each risk. So there will be 12 risks that we have sent out in the package, 12 risk input files in the package. Each tab has the table of contents that describes what each tab is. Essentially, how we use this input file is that we have Python language coded model, which takes this Excel-based input file and then do the calculation of lower and core and exposure and the mitigation analysis, and then spits out the output of the risk scores and all of the intermediate calculations to get to the risk score or RSEs. So this model is basically this file is the set of input values that the model uses. The model is just the same algorithm that goes through all of the input files whenever it receives. So how it's structured is that there is this 0, 1, the blue tabs that starts with the numbers that the model reads. The other tabs that's not colored or the numbers are reference tabs that you use to come up with the numbers in the blue tabs. So the 0 tab is global parameters. We specify how many simulations or trials that we would do per Monte Carlo simulation for the consequence side of the modeling. And then we specify some of the parameters for the run. Number 1 tab is the risk tab, where it describes what is the risk event this risk is, and then the analysis horizon, meaning that this is this risk, particular risk is failure of distribution overhead bowtie. We model it from 2020 through very long years, almost 95 years, through this horizon. So every year there is a separate risk score that's calculated, and the inputs associated with those each of the year within this time to period needs to be specified in this input file. And the exposure units and the test year, here the test year is the concept that I explained in the last workshop. This is the GRC year that we are looking at. Number 2 tab shows the bowtie elements.
Excuse me, Yumi?
Yeah, Tom? Yep.
A couple of questions. First, what if the test year is not indicated there? I was looking at the wildfire risk, and there's nothing about test year. What does that mean?
Oh, there was nothing on the test year? It should be. There should be, because yeah, maybe it was removed, but there should be one. Okay, it should be on all the risks. Yeah, I'll double check. Yeah, it should be the same 2023 for all of the years. Maybe it got extendedly removed when we were cleaning up the files for the wallpaper, but I will double check. Okay, and then you were saying the blue tabs, what do they represent on these in this Excel file? Yeah, so the blue tabs that starts with the numbers are what the model reads. What the model reads. Yes. And then the non-blue tabs are what? These are, so we started with usually reference and trench, or reference crosscutter, reference frequency. Those are the reference tabs that are used to come up with the numbers in the blue tab. So not all the details model needs to know. The model needs to know the binary input numbers, but this is to prepare those inputs.
Thank you.
The bow tie tab describes the three components of the bow tie. The first one is this table is the driver and subdriver of the risk event. So you see the driver, and for each of the driver, there are a list of subdrivers considered. And you can see for this particular risk, there are 63 subdrivers and 11 drivers. For the middle table describes the outcomes that were used, the 4 outcomes that you saw in the slide that I described the cross-cutting factor. And then the right table describes the consequence side attributes. So these are our standard MABF attributes. And then each risk input file will specify whether particular sub-attribute is applicable for that risk. So in this case, it's the electric risk, so gas reliability is not affecting, so it's not active in here. The next tab is number 3, trench tab. So now we specify the bow tie structure in tab 2. Tab 3 specifies the trench. So I can make it bigger.
You mean, I have a question, please?
Sure.
Could you kindly go back to what you were at before? You're talking about the attributes?
Yep.
What does a sub-attribute mean?
Yeah, so so this sub-attribute is basically the same thing as the attribute. It's the lower hierarchy of the attributes, but we call the sub-attribute, it's the same thing. There is just one sub-attribute, lower level attribute.
Yeah, it's following in the terminology of the settlement agreement, which has both attributes and sub-attributes. But for us, it's effectively the same.
Yeah, that's what's confusing me. I don't understand what you mean by a sub-attribute. There are only 4 attributes in this problem, I thought.
That's correct. In the settlement does talk about sub-attributes, right? It talks about, settlement agreement talks about each attribute shall have sub-attributes. And the way we've done it is there's only one sub-attribute for each attribute. So so yeah, effectively we don't have sub-attributes if you look at it that way.
Yeah, probably settlement doesn't have the sub-attribute as a terminology, but you can ignore the sub-attribute language, the terminology here. Basically, it's the model is looking at this column Q for the attribute.
This is Wendy. I'm a little confused by that. Can you go back to that? I mean, I wasn't involved in the SMAP and the settlement, but I'm assuming if the SMAP requires sub-attributes, then it would require something different than the attributes themselves. I don't know, this is kind of a question out there. What other things could be sub-attributes to safety, for example?
Okay, so maybe an example might be electric reliability, where we only included one sub-attribute, and the natural unit for that sub-attribute is customer minutes interrupted. But one could choose to include other natural units to explain the electric reliability, like number of customers affected, or maybe SID or whatever that they care about in the decision making. Then they could have multiple sub-attributes with the different units individually to explain the electric reliability attribute.
Yeah, so in the settlement, they talk about, they talked about top level attributes and lower level attributes. So what we call sub-attributes are the lower level attributes. And our attribute hierarchy, which is the principal one of the MABF in the settlement, mentions you have a hierarchy, and our hierarchy is basically one-to-one, right? I mean, there's top level attributes, and then under each top level attribute, there's one lower level attribute.
I think Tern is confused by your interpretation of the settlement. One possible illustration based on what Wendy said was to think of 3 top-level attributes: safety, reliability, and financial. And the reliability attribute would have 2 sub-attributes: electric reliability and gas reliability. I believe that in the settlement it says that you stop going down in levels when you get to something that's directly measurable, or words to that effect. So that means that there's no reason to think that safety has any sub-attributes. There's no reason to think that financial has any sub-attributes in your description of the multi-attribute value function. That's why it's confused.
Safety is an attribute, but still needs to be measured. And the thing that we measured is the exact lower level attribute that we're measuring is the equivalent fatalities, right? So that's how we've interpreted it. Same for electric reliability. There are other measures of electric reliability, but we chose customer minutes interrupted, and that's the lower level attribute that supports the overall reliability electric metric. I'm sorry, attribute.
This is something I believe that we will disagree about, because the way you measure something doesn't make it a sub-attribute. What you're saying is the attribute safety is measured by something called equivalent fatalities. You're saying that the attribute financial is measured by dollars. So this is something we can disagree about.
I will move on to trench test. This listed trenches that was
before you
chosen.
start, I apologize.
Sure.
Chris Parks does have his hand up, and I just want to make sure his question is addressed if he has one.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. I just took it down. I didn't intend to have that hand up. Sorry.
Yep, no worries. No worries at all. Just wanted to make sure. Yep. All right. Continue. We have about 12 minutes before we have a hard stop.
Sure. So this trench tab lists all the trenches and the exposures associated with it. And you will see that the year one is the first year of the analysis horizon that's specified in the risk tab 2020. It's going to be 2020 for all of our risks for this run. And then you see the blanks in here. When there is a blank, the model will use escalating method that's presented in the later columns. And here's the escalation method and escalation parameters. The reason that we used this one is that we didn't want to have a user to input like 100 columns for the exposure when it's the same value every year to minimize the number of inputs. So when this is provided for the first year, 2020, 298 miles of this trench. For the year 2 and the later, it is using escalation method of ESC with a 0 escalation factor. So it means that it's going to be the same every year over the horizon in terms of the number of trenches. And you will see that we use this escalation method and parameters across all of the tabs to describe how it changes over time.
Yumi, this is Wendy. Can I ask? It's a question I had earlier when you said, if I'm understanding, you're using 95 years in your model. Is that correct?
Yep.
95 years?
Yeah. For this risk, yes.
Okay. Is that discussed in the work papers, why you selected 95 years?
Mostly this one is driven by the number of years that a mitigation benefit lasts. So I'm not sure whether this particular risk has 90 years of benefit, the mitigations with 95 years of benefit, but probably shorter than that. But this one is probably catching all. But it is in the mitigation effectiveness work paper as the duration of the benefit or life of the benefit of mitigation. And say there is mitigation that lasts 50 years. then this end year needs to be at least 50 years from the start year so that we can capture the risk reductions in the year 50.
Hey, Jimmy, Wendy, go ahead, finish your question
Yeah, I just
first.
want to clarify. So does that mean you don't always use 95 years? You use various years?
Yes. Yes.
The maximum that
depending on the need
is 95?
Maximum might be 95. This might be the longest.
And what, this is 95 years for, is this for the mitigation or is this, I mean, I'm struggling with 95 years for any mitigation actually, because in the engineering world, the reason I bring this up in the engineering world, you know, we think of 40, 60 years as pretty long. In the nuclear industry, I know if they can get things to last 60 years. So I'm just struggling why you have 95 years.
I think so. I'm not the subject matter expert on when someone determines it's 90 years or 80 years, but I'm looking at the data that's represented here. The longest benefit year seems to be 80 years, and that's some of the programs. But if you have questions about why these are 80 years, then we'll have to defer to subject matter expert who determine that it's going to last 80 years.
The other thing to keep in mind, Wendy, is that we do discount the, as we talked about earlier, we do take the net present value for the risk reductions as well, right? So if you're looking at the benefit from the reduction 95 years out, just by the discounting alone, I was calculating the discounting. It's like, after you discount, it's like the discount factor is like 0.001 or something like that. If you're using 95 years, you mean using 80 years here, but you can see that after a while, it just gets minuscule. So that also helps to take into, I think, what you are considering.
Hey, Yumi, this is Steve Hain here. Can you go back to the page showing the test year and the escalation years?
Okay. This one.
You had one with the test year and a blank columns of the escalation years.
That's French. This one?
Yeah. The question is, why are those escalation year cells blank?
Oh, yes. So this was just model purpose. We didn't want users put the same numbers every year. So this is just for convenience, so that whenever this is blank, the Python model will look at the blanks and then use the escalation method that is specified in these two columns. So in this case, since year 2 is blank, we will look at these two parameters and determine that, okay, it's escalating at 0%. So the model will basically populate these numbers inside of the code.
Okay. And for those non-zero escalation numbers, which is not the case on this page, but in those instances where you have non-zero escalation parameters, how did you come up with those escalation factors?
It would be case by case. We'll have to take one example to explain how we came up with those escalation factors. Okay, then move on to step 4. So now we have specified the trench and trench exposure. The next step is to describe the left-hand side of the bow tie, where we explain the frequency of the event or likelihood of the risk event. So this step I will make it larger so that maybe it's easier to look at the column name. These 5 columns are just the numbers. The model is not going to care about it, but it lists basically for every combination of trench, subdriver, and outcome, so that a user can specify the frequency and the likelihood of risk event. So here, let's see what I could maybe hide a little bit here so that it's maybe easier to see in one screen. So in this case, let me so for this trend, this subdriver and this outcome, the exposure was, the trend exposure was 20,000-ish. And then the frequency was about 0.6 for that particular subdriver, leading into this chosen outcome. Then this LORE is what the model reads to interpret the frequency divided by exposure to get the likelihood of the risk event for that combination. Questions?
So Yumi, you are using the subdrivers then, not the drivers themselves in the model?
Right.
But my concern is once you get the output from your model, it's, to me, some of these subdrivers should have different mitigations. So how are you gonna identify that? I mean, how are you gonna follow it through?
Yes. So the model is calculating the risk score at the subdriver and outcome and trend level, as you said. And when we specify the mitigation effectiveness, we also require effectiveness to be represented at that granularity, so that like a particular mitigation could have different effectiveness specified for different subdrivers.
So that's in the work papers and in the model, you have to dig in to see how mitigation
you will see
match up
later.
to each subdriver.
Yes, and mitigation effectiveness work paper is the one to look at to see how each individual mitigation has effectiveness specified for which subdriver at what effectiveness.
And that is absolutely correct, Yumi. There is a question on the board from FETIA, but Wendy, I suggest that we pause here. It's a good opportunity to stop just prior to 2:30 and take about a 10-minute break, if anyone has objections. I think we'd return at 2:40. Is that acceptable to everybody? Steve, or are you good with that?
Yes, let's take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 2:40.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we are back. Let's see. During the break, someone asked me to send them the PG&E work papers because that person didn't receive them. We've had a lot of email servers rejecting the notices and communication from us, from both me and from Ken Arnold. So if for some reason you didn't receive anything that we mentioned during the workshop, send either me, Steve Hain, or Ken Arnold an email, and we'll take care of you. Thanks.
And isn't it correct that they're online, Ken? They are available on your website, right?
Yes, they are.
They are online. The zip file is a little bit large, so if someone has an issue with that, we can try and focus that down to smaller files. If people have specific requests, be happy to deal with that. Again, just send us an email. I think the RAMP PMT project management team email is at the end of this deck. We'll show it again at the end of the presentation, and we will work with anyone who has had issues or needs a smaller file size. And it's ramp 2020 PMT at pgne.com for people here.
Okay, are we all back and we can continue?
Yes, if we're going to continue, I'd like to just look at the FEI TA question, talking about the years mitigations will be effective. Do you have data sources documented in RAMP report to justify that? I think Yumi is about to get into the mitigation effectiveness work paper. So I think that's going to be answered as we move forward, just as an FYI. So Yumi, if you're ready and want to take the ball back, I think we can move forward.
Sure. So this one, we talked about tab 4, which described the likelihood of risk event for each combination of trench, subdriver, and outcome. Tab 5 is frequency multipliers, where when we think that there is a separate need for multipliers to the frequency specified in here, or likelihood or frequency specified in here, we use this tab to specify that multipliers. So the number of columns are, the combination of the columns are the same. Basically, it has trench and subdriver outcome, the same combination. The model in general will choose for all of the tabs. If you see the active column that's false, then the model is not gonna use it. Only the ones that are true in here, the model will use that information. In this case, let's say for this particular trench, fire driven, so this is subdriver is for the, I think the driver is natural, where is the driver? The driver name is not here. This one is a subdriver of our some climate driver, where it's the fire driven asset failures. And you can see that we used the multipliers that starts from here. And you see that there are blanks in here, which means that the model should look at the escalation method and parameters associated with it. And in this case, the method is different than what you saw earlier. It was escalation before, but this time it is match. Whenever there is a match, the model will look for what's the escalation curve for the wildfire match case. And that is explained or specified in the later tab in here. Oh, we forget to color this tab, but tab 12 is specifying escalation method for the ones that have match method. So in this case, there are multiple climate factors that we included to escalate over time. And this tab 12, for example, wildfire row is specifying the escalation rate. And you can see here that it's 1, and then starting from 2023, it's going to escalate at 3%. And every 5 years, we chose to escalate the multipliers so that we can reflect the long-term climate change impact to the valuation. And And so that tab, I think, going back to here, even though this says 1, because this is blank, it's going to look for wildfire escalation factor, and that is specified in tab 12. And so the model will basically choose to escalate over time for that particular subdriver. Okay, and this is how we incorporate the climate change cross-cutting factor. So now we have specified the left-hand side of the bow tie. Starting from this tab 6 and tab 7 is specifying the right-hand side of the bow tie. So it is when the event happens, what is the consequence when the event happens? So this tab also has starting from like the index columns, which you can ignore. The consequence is specified for each combination of trench, outcome, and sub-attribute. So in this case, for let's say this trench and this outcome, there is 3 sub-attributes that we specify for the consequence of the event happening. And again, choose the active columns only. And the first, so you can see the 2 sets of columns here. One is distribution 1 related columns. Here, distribution 2 related columns. And then there are distribution operator. So a lot of cases, we only have just one distribution specified like this, but there are some of the risks there we specified another distribution with operator so that we can combine 2 distributions together to represent the consequence of event happening. So in example, let's talk about this first distribution first. So let me just make it bigger. So in this example, so that the 4 columns are used to describe one distribution. Distribution 1 here specifies what is the type of distribution for specifying this consequence. In this case, it's binomial EF. This is more explained in our user guide. And then this distribution 1 prop is explaining what is the probability of having this consequence when the event happens. So even though an asset failure event happens, it doesn't always result in a consequence on the safety side. So this probability is further used to specify the probability of having this consequence when an event happens. So the consequence distribution that will happen, basically the conditional distribution is specified in using the parameters columns in here. So in this case, parameter 1 and 2 is used to describe this distribution. And what this means is specified in distribution parameters tab, in tab 13. And there is, let's say, binomial EF in here. The first parameters show number of trials, and the second one shows the probability. And how these are being used is more described in user guide. It's not moving. I'm trying to move the user guide. I'm not able to do that. So if you look at our user guide that's sent out as part of this package, it's gonna show how we defined this distribution. Especially, we defined these EF distributions to represent equivalent fatality distributions. So this is our custom distribution modifying the usual binomial distribution. When there are 2 distributions that needs to be specified to represent a consequence from an event, in this case, so for electric reliability, we chose to include these parameters. So say it's a log normal distribution with this mean and standard deviation. It happens with 99.9% probability when the event happens. And then we multiply with normal distribution that happens 100% between, with the mean 7.5 and 0.83 for the standard deviation. So this is what the model will do, basically read these two sets of columns and then combine with the operator. In this case, if it's a sum, it's going to be summing these two components together to come up with the consequence. Any questions?
Hi, Yumi. This is
Yumi, Steve Hain here. So you are using log normal distribution to model anything that impacts reliability. Is that correct?
For anything that impacts, I think mostly we use reliability. I have not confirmed with whether we have used the log number for all of our consequence. But in this case, we use the log number for this one.
That's my question is, if that were the case, I don't know if that's the case, so we'll have to confirm. But if that were the case, I think I might have a problem with that because not everything that affects reliability can be adequately captured by a log normal distribution.
And can you provide an example on?
No, I cannot. No, not right now. Not at this time. No, not during the workshop.
Steve, are you done for now?
Yeah. Yes, for now.
Yumi, I have a question. It's looking like for electric reliability. What was the driver again? Can you go back and show on the top?
For this one?
Driver for the top rows, the top 3 rows. Okay, so it's elevated wire down, small copper, something. And I'm a little
trench.
Yeah, I'm a little confused by the term tranche here because I thought in the ramp you were using tranche for the 8 tranches. High fire, non-fire, high fire, and distribution, transmission, substation. So I'm a little confused by the term tranche here. But anyway, my question is, when you go over again to the, can you scroll over again? Okay, so the probability is very high for a reliability incident. Is that correct? It's almost 1, right?
Yes. So what this means is not the probability of risk event happening. It is more when the risk event happens, what is the probability of having reliability consequence in this particular trench and outcome?
My other question is anywhere in the modeling, do you also account for the relationship to whether or not there's a fault, an actual electrical fault? And what type of fault? I mean, did you guys, because I'm just trying to kind of connect the dots, you know, when you have these asset failures and we have other incidents. I mean, engineering world, we're used to thinking about electrical faults, whether or not there's a fault or not, and most of the times there's a fault. So I'm just, it looks like you haven't included that. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by fault, electrical fault.
Well, usually you wouldn't, normally you wouldn't have an ignition and there was actually some kind of incident on the power system that would be detected by the protection system that, you know, that there's a, we call it a fault, a single phase to ground fault or, you know, other kinds of faults, electrical faults. So I'm just, and the reason I'm bringing it up because you have different mitigations sometimes depending on the types of faults that trigger, that, you know, that are occurring. And I think they're mostly single line to ground faults. So I've just been thinking about that more, and it seems like that matters.
So, yeah, let me try to answer. what I think what you're asking. I think those are showing up in this particular risk as a subdriver of equipment failure. Let's see, subdriver. Yeah, so there is a subdriver. Let me go back to the bow tie first. On the left-hand side, this is particularly a failure of electric overhead, distribution overhead risk. So it doesn't include, for example, transmission overhead as a failure. So this is only talking about distribution overhead as a failure. You can see here that the driver of this event is including distribution line equipment failure. And out of this, there are subdrivers that's currently based on the type of asset the type of equipment that actually failed to lead to the risk event, right? So let's say you have a mitigation that only addresses this conductor. So you're replacing conductors, then it wouldn't mitigate the risk that's coming from the rest of the drivers in this category, right? And so by specifying the effectiveness at the subdriver level, particularly that the mitigation is affecting or trying to reduce, we will be able to tie it together. But then the consequence side of the modeling, so the likelihood of an event by subdriver is specified in tab 4. However, the consequence side, you will see that there is no drivers specified or subdrivers specified in here. We are categorizing different types of outcomes in different types of consequences in different outcomes. So basically in this frequency tab, what it's doing is that for different outcomes, it's looking at, okay, what are all of the subdrivers that impacts that outcome? So let's say if particular subdrivers only affecting the particular outcome, then you wouldn't see other outcomes associated with that driver. Right? But then the consequence specification will only be done at the outcome level, not at the subdriver level, because it's already representing the kind of outcomes that you would anticipate from that set of drivers or subdrivers. Does that clarify a little further?
I have to think about it, but I mean, the reason I bring it up too is that there is research going on to pick up pre-fault conditions before a fault occurs. And there's a lot of, there's fault recorders on your systems. So there's a lot of data related to faults that are, already being, gathered on any electric system. So anyway, I just have to think about it more, but thank you.
Sure. So this is specifying consequence, again, for its outcome trends and attribute level. And then the consequence multipliers are used to specify probably the cross-cutting factors that we talked about. So here, it shows the RIM example where for all of the financial consequences of attribute for trends and outcome that's specified in each row, it is using this 2.15% multipliers for the consequence that's specified in this tab to incorporate the impact of the RIM in this risk event. And the same thing happens in here. Since there is the blank in here, it's going to use the escalating factors. But then you see that there is blank in here. This is the same as just no escalation. So it's the same as escalating at 0%. So that concludes our baseline risk assessment or quantification, like specifying the bow tie, trends, exposure, and then frequency or likelihood of event, and then the consequence event. And that is the baseline assessment. Starting from tab 8 is where the mitigation analysis starts. So tab 8 is listing out the mitigations or programs that we call for addressing this risk. So in this case, What's relevant is the name of the program. And then you see on the right that these two columns, although it's not highlighted, this is important distinction. For each mitigation, it's specifying whether it is modifying the likelihood or the frequency of the risk event, or whether it's modifying the consequence of the risk event, or both. So in this case, you see that, let's see whether we can see the example. So this is enhanced vegetation management, is addressing the likelihood of the risk event happening, meaning that the outage from happening from the vegetation contact. And then this one is grasshopper and KPF switch replacement. This one is addressing the consequence from happening, even though the SF failure happens at somewhere. And then this is 3A3C addresses both sides as well. So then we will need to specify like how it's affecting the likelihood and how it's affecting the consequence of the risk event. So that's the important information to know from the model perspective. And then there is the case column here. So case column is, like, let me show you examples of here. So proposed, enhanced, inherent, and then there are three alternatives. So the case column is specifying which portfolio that we are considering as a mitigation. So let me choose proposed. This is our proposed mitigation, set of mitigations. Alternatives, the alternative portfolio of the mitigations. So in the proposed case, you can see these programs included, and then in the proposed case, then you will see alternative 1, including a similar set of mitigations, but then including some alternative that included in as part of the that alternative. I think that the M11A is included in this subset, but it's included with the other mitigations in a portfolio. So that's specifying which mitigation applies to which portfolio. Tom?
Yes. Are you, when it's a proposed, when the case is proposed, and you showed us that there were numerous mitigations that were part of the proposed case.
Yep.
Is the model breaking out the mitigation effectiveness for each of those separate mitigations within the proposal?
Yep. So as I explained in the last workshop, the process is that in the later text in here, it explains the effectiveness of the program, each program. And then the model will aggregate all of the effectiveness to come up with overall effectiveness of the portfolio. It will calculate the risk reduction of the portfolio, and then allocate back to each of the mitigations in the portfolio based on the marginal effectiveness. So as a part of the output, it is the risk reduction allocated to each mitigation in a portfolio so that we can calculate the RSC by the program.
And I appreciate you referencing the last workshop. This is a little bit of a sophisticated concept, at least to my mind. The allocation, you said the allocation is based on the marginal or incremental contribution.
Yep.
Doesn't that mean then you need to know the contribution of each individual, or the impact of each individual mitigation?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's separately calculated for each one.
Yep.
Why do you need to do them the allocation then if you have a separate calculation for each one? I don't.
Oh, so it is, in a way, it is not separately. Yes. Let me go back to that slide. So in a way, it is not separately calculating based on its own individual effectiveness, which was like 10, 20, 60. Rather, we are calculating overall effectiveness, which is in this case 71%, and then allocating back to each mitigation based on our assumed allocation factors. And that's coming from like marginal risk reduction. So the approach that we took is we calculate the overall risk reduction first, and then allocating back to each mitigation rather than the vice versa. If we calculate from each individual mitigation, let's say 10, 20, 60, the total is, sometimes it can go over 100%. So we didn't want to do that.
Well, I think we're going to need to see how this plays out when we look at individual risks. I have in mind wildfire, and I think you have grid hardening as maybe a single mitigation when grid hardening actually consists of numerous different activities. So I'm concerned that we're going to be able to trace the impacts of each separate grid hardening activity, but we'll have to see how that plays out when we look more closely at that.
Yep. So that was the program. And then since we specified which program is in which portfolio and how
you need really quick, do you have any controls in this one? Do you have any controls?
Controls? Oh, yeah. Oh, for this one is, yes, there is a one control. I think it's enhanced inspections. You will be able to see in the inherent case. Thank you for the question. So enhanced inspections for distribution was modeled in this photo.
You only did a couple of controls, right?
Yeah, probably two. One for this risk, and then the other one for, I think, the gas risk leak management. Okay. Once we specify the mitigations, and then the next step is to specify how much we are going to do in terms of the scope, and then what is the cost of those mitigations, those programs. So this tag is basically for specifying that. So let me just zoom in a little bit more. So, and the granularity of the inputs are by program and trench. So the cost and the exposure needs to be entered by the trench level so that we can do the trench level risk reduction as well as the RSC calculation. So for this case, enhanced vegetation management, for this particular trench, we have to only look at the ones that's active. These 7 columns are describing how much we are doing in terms of units of exposure. Since our unit of exposure for this risk is miles, this one is saying that, oh, well, we are doing or we are planning to do to 12 miles each year over the next 3 years. And then this one is saying we split it into 2, enhanced vegetation management program into 2 periods so that we can separate prior to the test year versus post, for the GRC period, next GRC period programs, so that we can calculate test year baseline risk score and then do the RSC analysis for the next GRC period programs. So you see that for this miles, it's the same 12 miles each year for these 2 periods every year. And then the next columns are the capital costs for each year. And then the following columns are O&M costs for each year. I wonder why this is zeros, but maybe it's because I set the calculations to force. Maybe it's not showing up the number in here. So that's specifying the scope and cost. And then
can I ask Yumi? So what you're calling tranche here is what's the difference with tranche and subdrivers? I'm just a little confused.
Okay. So you can think of trends as subgroup of our system for representing this risk. So, we have how many miles of, so 80,000 miles or 81,000 miles of distribution overhead assets that we have in our system that's represented in this risk. And then we are breaking down that 81,000 miles into 5 buckets. That's defined by this. So the first one is 22,000 miles, and then the second one is 4,000 miles. So for each of these trends, which is a different, basically a group of assets that's represented in these miles, we are specifying the separate bow tie in a way, or quantifying different risk score for that trend. Does it make sense? So that we can see which one has higher risk than the other one. And if we do the work in one trend, it's not going to result in the risk reduction of the other trends. So you can think of it as different disaggregation of our system into more like risk profile, so that we can do a separate analysis and be able to see which one has more higher risk.
Okay, so let me clarify then. I've been focusing on wildfire. So if it was wildfire, it would be tranches for wildfire.
Yes, so wildfire
and
has,
this, and I just want to understand, and this is for your electric distribution non-wildfire risk. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, correct.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
So wildfire would have trenches that's separated by distribution, and then high fire threat district or non-high fire threat district, and further by whether we have hardened or not for the distribution side. So it has a lot more trenches than this one.
But now, why wouldn't, for example, small copper conductors be a concern for wildfire?
It would be. So ideally, it would be nice if we model like in one place. But how we chose, because this distribution overhead risk and wildfire is a separate risk in our corporate risk register, how we chose was that if an asset failure in distribution overhead result in ignition, we moved that over to the wildfire risk. This particular risk only considers the outcomes that's not related to the ignition.
Yeah, no, I understand that part. What I'm trying to say, maybe I wasn't clear, is it seems to me small copper conductors are a concern, for breaking and igniting wildfires. So I'm trying to understand why you haven't broken down the 8 tranches that are in the wildfire more defined to this kind of, to not small copper conductor, but other things too.
Sure, I think that's valid because I think we have next workshop reserved for wildfire only. I think that probably is a place to discuss that.
Well, you can start thinking about, yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. So moving on to the effectiveness, now we specified which programs and then how much we are doing and how much we are spending. And then the next step is how much it's effective in reducing the likelihood or consequence. So tab 10 is about the effectiveness on the frequency side. And then tab 11 is effectiveness on the consequences side. So tab 10 is granularity the same as the frequency tab, which is trend, subdriver, and outcome. And also you only have to look at the ones that are active. So let's say I choose the true ones in the active column. And the effectiveness for this particular subdriver is specified in here with the benefit life of 30 years. And then you can see additional escalation method again here, assuming that the year 1 benefit might not be the same as year 2 benefit or year 3 benefit from the program that you implemented in year 1. So this escalation method is if SME wants to incorporate that degradation of the benefits over time, then this escalation factors can be used with parameters. In here, it's not. I think there's one more column in here. Oh no, here degradation rate is 0, so it's not assuming that it's going to degrade over time. But so that's the effectiveness on the frequency side. And similarly for the consequence side, the same thing. It is looking at instead of a subdriver, you need to specify the sub attribute that the mitigation is reducing the consequence when the event happens. So in this case, this effectiveness column, so let's say this one is only true, so 90% effective in preventing this particular consequence from this particular program. And the same for the benefit, right? And that's basically all. Yep.
You mean those effectiveness numbers are estimated by subject matter experts?
Yes. That's a good segue into our mitigation effectiveness work paper. So you can see all of our input files will have the effectiveness specified for each combination of the trench and outcome and program. And then you might be able to see it easily from this table on the summary, the first tab, where we specify, okay. Yeah, the same information is in here, but the reference of that is, there is a source file reference in here for that mitigation effectiveness work paper. So in this case, I think DOH, yeah, this one, DOH 14 is the mitigation effectiveness work paper. And I think that's what I have opened in here, DOH 14. So this, every effectiveness work paper will have this table that this is what SAB provided. So for each mitigation, it describes the program as well as it shows whether it modifies the likelihood or the consequence of the event. And this is the driver or subdriver it impacts or the consequence it impacts. And then the mitigation effectiveness, and there are separate tabs if it needs more space. And then there's justification of the effectiveness written down in here. And then effectiveness benefit length as well, as someone asked earlier about how whether we have justification for that. I think it's in, yeah, it's in here, justification for mitigation benefit length. And then further assumptions if it needs to be provided. So that information is available as a source doc.
Can you explain, Yumi, please, the relationship between what you just showed us in tab 10, and I believe it was column R, to what is in tab 4, which is the frequency?
Okay. So this column is the likelihood of the event happening from a particular subdriver, or let's say animal contact. The tab 10 is specifying that, okay, now I know my risk and I know the probability of that event happening. And then let's say a particular program has effectiveness of 50%. It means that if we are doing the work in, let's say, 1 mile of particular trench, it's gonna reduce the likelihood by 50%.
And that is the likelihood shown in tab 4, which is, I believe, labeled frequency. And that's the frequency, is it not, of the joint event of a driver and an outcome?
It is a joint, yes. Joint of the driver and outcome, yes.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So every tab will have outcome and trench as default, and here as well, it specifies the outcome. Okay, so that is basically all of the inputs that the model requires. Once this one is read to the model will crank the numbers and then outputs the result. Are we ready to move on? Yeah, Wendy?
Yumi, can you go back to the tranches?
Sure.
So can you explain what's the difference? Or can someone explain how does PG&E determine whether a circuit mile is high, moderate, or poor reliability, assuming it's not a small copper conductor? Is that based on SAIDI, and what is that based on?
I hope there is source file that's explained in here. So it should be described in the source file that's referenced in here. So I hope
Wendy,
probably
I think
you'll
you're
be
kind
able
of
to see
diving
more
into.
information.
Yeah, sorry, Yumi, and you can go and answer, but Wendy, you have, I think, kind of an eye for detail, and you have a full day with the wildfire group, where I think they most likely will be able to I think, guide you to the answers a little bit better than Yumi at this juncture.
But if I'm understanding Yumi correct, these are not in the wildfire risk model. Is that correct, Yumi? These are only in the electric distribution overhead model. Yeah. They're not in the wildfire risk model. The wildfire risk model, the tranches are very different. They're
yeah, so maybe I misspoke, Wendy. It's definitely a line of business question, and maybe I said wildfire, and I think it's a question for the experts, and maybe not so much for Yumi, for the experts that worked on the filing, the actual risk team.
So what is actually provided right now? What's public that describes these different tranches more? I mean, how they're determined and everything.
So it should be, in general, if you look at our package, you can go to the wildfire folder, and there is the same risk info file. And if you look at the trends there is a source file that's listed there. And you can look at the source file associated with the trends. The source file should enough explain about the trenches. And also, I believe our testimony also describes each trend in more descriptive way as well. And not the testimony, but the chapter. Each risk chapter should list all of the trenches that were considered for that risk, and then explains in more detail.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to move on to the output file that we sent to you. So I'm sure that you are familiar with this visual now if you have reviewed our RAMP report. This was actually created by, Tom?
Yes, Yumi. We are not aware of receiving output files. I'm referring to, for example, table 2-2 of the user guide, which has a list of model outputs and tells us various worksheets that we're supposed to have. We could not find these in the work papers that were sent to us.
So I believe that if you click into each risk, so I'm just trying right now. So this is the folder before it was zipped. And it has the source.index, but out of that, there is a bowtie version file. So the one that starts with a bowtie in the folder explains, this bowtie file is the output that I'm showing here.
Okay, so I'm going to take a moment. I'm sorry I'm going to take time, but this is very important to us. We really looked hard for this. We looked for something called output. You're telling us now it's got a different name, apparently. So I'm going to the work papers, the zip file that you gave us, and let's see. You want me to look for which risk?
Failure of electric distribution overhead assets.
Okay. All right. I see something there at the top that does say bow tie. Now indulge me for a moment. Let's look at the wildfire one, okay? Let's open the wildfire. So there you're saying, and so there I see two ones that say bow tie.
Yes.
One is bow tie V1. I'm not sure I have the full file name open here, but V1.1.1, and then HFT Donnelly, and then one that doesn't say HFT Donnelly. These are these, is this the output document you're referring to? Which one?
So for the wildfire risk only, we included one more file associated with just high fire threat district. Because the risk was, I think that's because also the chapter, wildfire chapter shows two bow ties. One is the entire service territory, and then the other one is zooming into the high fire district trenches only. So that's why there are two files. But if you want to look at just the overall, then it's the first file. If you just want to zoom into the high fire threat district trenches only, then it's the second file.
Okay, so now if I open that, and I'm not going to do it now because my computer is going to be slow, but if I do that, I'm going to see each of the worksheets that you've listed in table -2-2 in the user guide.
2-2.
Page 20 of the user guide.
Oh, page 22 of the user guide.
Page 20, table 2-2. I'm looking at the hard copy. It may be a different PDF.
Yeah, I am. I'm looking at the PDF.
Just look for table 2-2.
Yes, table, yes.
Oh, so all of those worksheets will be found in these bow tie files. Okay, we just had a devil of a time. You kept telling us that there were these things called risk outputs, and we couldn't find them.
Oh, that name was not
never used.
The model output.
Risk model outputs is the title, is the heading that's repeatedly used in the user guide, and it's not what you use in your work papers.
Sorry, it might be our oversight.
That's good feedback, Tom. I appreciate that. We'll think about that in the future.
Yep. So the first step is the bow tie. This will be the visual that we copied and pasted into each risk chapter. Each of the cell will have the formula associated with, and it's using the tabs that's behind here. And then this one is the consequence table, and you will see the formula, how we calculated this consequence using the information that's in the later tabs. And this consequence table is included in each of the risk chapter as well. So you will be able to see how this were obtained. And then the portfolio tab is showing, these are just the output of the model, so you don't have any calculation starting from here to the end. So this one is the, for each of the mitigation plan, I think it's one of the tables in that chapter, risk chapter, the total cost and MPV of the risk reduction in the spend and the RC associated with it for the portfolio. Tom?
So Yumi, this gets back to my question. So row 2 of this worksheet, failure distribution overhead assets, has the proposed mitigation plan, and it gives an RSC. But that's for the portfolio, right?
Yeah.
We don't want the portfolio. At least we want to see the individual mitigation. So. Okay.
Yes. So that is in here. Although there are more granular outputs from the model that we didn't include in here, but if you need, I think we can provide it to you. So this one is for each of the portfolio. By mitigation, it shows MPV of the risk reduction allocated to each mitigation.
Okay, so let me just ask then, just use this as an example. The second mitigation is M2 system hardening.
Yep.
If you say M2, does that mean that's as granular as you've gotten in assessing mitigation effectiveness, or is there a possibility of M2 being broken down further?
This particular M2 actually were broken down into two. One is overhead. I think the other one is undergrounding, because they are distinct in terms of the effectiveness. So if you look at the input file, I think it's in here. Maybe this would be better place. So maybe just do it here. So let me just choose system hardening. So you can see that there is a bracket here. Whenever there is a bracket in the program name of each risk input file, that means that we have broken one program into maybe two, so that we can further differentiate one program. So in this case, it's overhead as well as undergrounding. And the effectiveness and the exposure and other information was actually calculated at that level and then aggregated later on.
Okay, so I shouldn't just automatically assume if I see something that's an M number, an M followed by a Roman numeral.
There are multiple examples. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I think the question though too, I'm not sure, Tom, but I mean, you don't break it down into the types of system hardening for overhead lines, correct?
Absolutely. That's the concern that we have. Yes.
Right.
Yumi, this is Jonathan Lesser. I noticed.
Jonathan, before I think Wendy had a question for.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, I'm done. I'm writing down my notes.
Okay.
Yumi, again, this is Jonathan Lesser. I had a question. I took a quick look at the bow tie file that you said is the output, and I notice the file is just numbers. There are no formulas, etc. in there. Where would we find all of the calculations? The actual calculations that lead to the numbers in the output file?
Yes, that's a good question. So one thing that what our model is doing is Monte Carlo simulation. So the model itself is doing the calculation within the Python code. So there is no Excel spreadsheet that does the calculation, right? So what we have is that when the Python code reads the Excel input files, it will crank in the numbers and then output a bunch of intermediary results, but not the calculation. So it might be a little hard for you to chase down how we translate the input to the output that you see in here. We understand that. So what we have provided to you was, I think it's in the user guide folder as a separate attachment of the user guide, an Excel file that illustrates for one particular risk event. I think that's huge distribution distribution network assets to show what actually is happening in the Python code, so that you can somewhat walk through from the inputs and the calculations to get to the final numbers or risk scores and the RCs. So I hope that this might be helpful to understand how we are using the inputs to calculate the outputs. But if you have further questions about intermediate calculations that are happening for the particular risk, that's hard to understand using this file as well as maybe user guide, let us know.
So did you provide the actual Python code as in the work papers?
No, we did not.
Is that something we're allowed to see?
This is Tessa Carlberg. I believe that some of the code may be proprietary, but we can speak offline about maybe setting up a WebEx between parties, and we can figure out a way to share that information.
Thank you.
Yumi, this is Tom. So you're saying if we want to understand how you went from the inputs to the outputs, we want to see it for an example, and that's what you have on the screen here now. This is a file that was included as part of the user guide work papers. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so this is an example that relates to which risk?
Distribution network assets from the electric side. The failure of distribution network assets.
Distribution what assets?
Network
assets.
Yeah.
And so this looks like this alone could be the subject of the next hour. I mean, I'm not saying we should do it. But there's a lot of tabs here.
Yeah.
This is a fairly complicated bridge to go over to get from inputs to outputs. I'm sorry, to get from inputs to the outputs. It seems like it's a fairly complicated operation that happened.
Yeah, there's like yes. So I think the algorithm or the calculation or the formula itself is simple. It's just likelihood times the consequence of risk events. But then the processing of the inputs and some Monte Carlo simulations and how we account for each of the probabilities and mitigation analysis. So it's a bit complicated to do it in Excel, but so that's why there is need for like many tabs in here. But you can see that here, the 3 tabs are the inputs, so probably summarizing our risk input files. And this shows how we are using the simulated or Monte Carlo simulation result to calculate the core values. And then the rest of the output tabs are explaining like how we calculate the frequency and then the expected natural units per event if you wanted to take a look at the more detailed information, and then the core value, risk score, and the summary. So I don't think it's too much complicated, but if you need a walkthrough of this file, let us know. I think that's something that we can do.
Thank you. Let me ask the question then. So you've given this as an example. Why haven't you given it for each of the different risks?
Because it's the one Excel might be too much to, it creates efforts to create this tab because each risk has different number of outcome trends, drivers, subdrivers, and also the simulation itself. Some of the, in this case, this one we just took the simplest example from our bow tie. This one didn't have too many, like 3 trenches, and subdrivers are not that many as you have seen from the other bow tie. So it takes an effort to create this file, and the file becomes really big.
Tom, maybe we can try to understand what objectives, what you're looking for. Maybe we can, once we understand that, we can come up with a kind of best way to help you out.
Sure, I appreciate that. We're just asking questions now and trying to understand what's available and what's not. You can appreciate that that one objective is likely to be, given that we may have disagreements with PG&E about how you constructed your multi-attribute value function, about your tranches, about many things. I mean, you're just giving it, your best effort, but we'd like to be able to provide alternative numbers, and we need to be able to use our alternative numbers for these various parameters in the model to yield different.
So one thing about the settlement agreements, it does mention the ability upon request for us to run scenario analysis. Maybe that's something we can explore in terms of, because as you can see from these input files, it's quite complicated to model things. And before we settle on and there are probably different ways you can model things too, right? Or make sure that they're modeled correctly. So I think working together to define and put together the input files for your scenarios or your alternatives might just throw that out there and see what you think of that.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have to have further discussions about this, and of course, Turn will need to confer with its experts, after this workshop to digest what we're hearing today and figure out our next steps.
So Tom, I would just, if possible, I'd like to ask if Rasa could be in those conversations too.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'd certainly like as many parties as possible, as many entities as possible, trying to model alternatives if there are disagreements about how PG&E has what values it's using throughout the whole process.
Tom, this is Steve Hain here. So instead of having side conversations outside of the workshop environment, do you think that there may be value in having an additional follow-up workshop so that other parties can participate also? I throw this question out to everybody, not necessarily just to Tom yourself.
Right. Of course, not everyone's a participant that's able to speak. In fact, most aren't. But Turn would certainly be open to that. This is a level of detail, and I'm glad we have experts that are going to be able to help us. I'm not sure every party is in that position, but we would certainly be open to being as inclusive as possible in further discussions about how to be able to model alternatives to what PG&E has, how PG&E has gone about this.
Yeah, of course. And if we do have a follow-up workshop, then we will have to have sufficient time for public notice. And that could be a couple of weeks. That would mean the workshop would be a couple of weeks from now. And then we also have to consider the possibility that there may be the need for a workshop to discuss risks chapters besides the wildfire risk chapter, because we really haven't had an opportunity to talk about those risks. So those are the questions we need to consider.
Steve, I think and I'm not shying away from that, but I think it makes sense to give participants that weren't able to attend, an opportunity to review the user guide, which is fairly robust, review the example that was provided, which was significant work. And then if there are any questions immediately, we could take those on, make the answers, public, and then from there we can derive, next steps. That seems to be kind of the right approach. There's a lot on the board at the moment, and I think giving people a chance to digest, ask questions, and maybe that leads to another workshop. Maybe it doesn't, but it certainly, I think, moves the wheel forward on the conversation.
Steve,
this is Wendy. I mean, I was trying to wait. I wasn't sure. I don't know if we're wrapping this up, this part right now, and if we were going to talk about the agenda for the July 30th workshop, which I'd like to do also. So
Yeah, go ahead and talk about that now, just in case people may be hanging up. So I don't want them to hang up and miss this portion of the discussion. Let's talk about that now.
Okay. So we did decide to focus it on wildfire, you know, per Turn's suggestion, which is great. One thing, something that came to mind, I would like to make sure that the appropriate T&D lines of business are in attendance at this wildfire, including the people that work, including including people that have knowledge of the other electric distribution risk chapters. Even though we're not going to go through that next time, I think there are connections between electric distribution safety issues and wildfire issues. Some faults will, they could cause, an electrocution, and they could also cause a wildfire. So they are related. So, that's number one I'd like to request. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is perhaps, and I think this is related, having time at the end of that wildfire workshop, at least an hour, to talk about if there's any real big deficiencies that we have already, that staff parties are seeing, where perhaps rather than alternatives, we may be wanting to discuss next steps to have PG&E remediate some significant deficiencies. And I'm talking about a number of things. So I'll just say out loud. The first one is the PSPS as a mitigation measure, because in PG&E mentioned that they did not have time to comply with Wildfire Safety Division's final resolutions to not use RSE for that. But that would be one thing to talk about. How could that be addressed rather than waiting? My concern is waiting for RASA to come up with a report in mid-October. Perhaps we want to just all of a sudden kind of have some time to talk about what could we do? What could PG&E do? Can PG&E, start addressing some deficiencies? The other types of deficiencies are kind of what we're getting to with the modeling itself, I think. And if they're significant enough, rather than Turn having to do, all of this, perhaps we can make sure that there's a work done so that we inform PG&E what we want them to run too. I don't want to take it away. I'm not saying, Tom, that Turn couldn't also do alternatives, but I think there's there's very big concerns about the wildfire tranches, for example. And then Turn has, identified, some other issues. There's real big concerns that the controls have not had the risk analysis, modeling done, most of the controls. So I would like to spend, I think it'd be probably at the end of that July 30th workshop and maybe the last hour. And then I want to give people time to think about that. But does parties want to weigh in?
This is Tom. Turn fully support what you're suggesting, and we don't look forward to the prospect of having to try to rerun the model and put alternative values on our own. So we welcome that. We think that's a great idea to have an hour at the end of the workshop to talk about things that might be able to be done in the interim to address identified deficiencies.
I don't know if this is along the same lines, but what would help me is trying to understand how the business processes will connect with this work within PG&E. So to what extent this will be leveraged and how so in their decision making, and or how it will fold into business processes. I'm trying to just understand in terms of lifting the lens on the risk analysis about the degree to which this will be practical for PG&E and sort of grow with the company.
Well, we'll if I might reply just my own thinking when you're mentioning that, I'm not sure we could tackle all of that, that you're mentioning at the workshop, but we could possibly. But one of the things you've said to me is critical. When I brought up earlier why I was concerned that electrical faults, and pre-fault conditions and things like that aren't kind of part of the risk analysis. To me, that's a big connection with in the power engineering world and what the PG&E engineers and, they're collecting. Why are they collecting all this, data and stuff? And they're doing more with it than I think shows up in this risk analysis. So my concern is more on the front end, I guess, if you might say. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that. Because if we don't get the front right design of the whole modeling, then the back end stuff that comes out is going to be harder to utilize.
Yeah, and I guess for me, it's sort of the feedback. It's hard, I think struggling with sort of how to critique or how to suggest in terms of this without understanding the downstream implications. So, the parts of this that are going to be used tomorrow, the parts of this that are already being leveraged by PG&E, how does this fold into existing processes? Do new business processes need to be created? And I'm not sort of saying that there needs to be a deep dive into that, but I guess just sort of, at a high level, what parts of this fold into existing PG&E practices? Because I think none of us, I know there's a lot of wonderful work that went into this, and I think, I certainly don't want to be providing feedback that moves it in a different direction, that maybe moves it from a more practical to a place where it would just sit on a shelf somewhere and gather dust. And so, I just think it's helpful to understand how this connects to the rest of the business, even at a high level, just so that, we can be most effective in terms of constructive feedback.
Mr. Abrams, I hear that feedback. I'm gonna think about that one for a little bit, especially with the scope of the next workshop. So I hear you. I just need to consider that. As far as Wendy and your request for that back hour regarding the discussion on deficiencies, maybe you could give me a little bit more on what you're looking for. Again, that's not that far out. I just want to make sure that people are prepared and it's within scope, and we can meet, I guess, your request with 6 days until that workshop, which is a pretty large lift on our part, right? So I just want to make sure that we're going to cut out a whole hour of a day that our presentation meets your expectations. So I think just being a little bit more
sure. Ken, I'm not expecting you to present anything. SPD would present.
Okay.
Lead the discussion. I'm just
trying to think about how you transition from, okay. I'll think about that one as well, Wendy.
Well, maybe Tern can weigh in, but basically my idea is this could, we've already found some deficiencies that we believe are critical, and it sounds like other parties, like Tern has too. And instead of waiting until October for RASA to do a report, I wanted to put them out on the table now and than a data request, really discuss, you know, could PG&E go back and do work? Perhaps file a ramp amendment for the wildfire chapter in particular. This is the kind of discussion I want to have the last hour of the July 30th workshop. And SPD, we will lead that discussion.
Hey, Wendy, this is Steve here. Would it be possible for you to share your concerns on a wildfire risk with the workshop participants, with the service list?
Yes, I'm not ready to do that. I mean, I've started drafting something, and honestly, I would, if Tom is willing, it would be great to actually get some thoughts in. Yes, I could try to do that 2 days before.
So we could share that, distribute that to this service list ahead of the July 30th workshop. That way, they will lay the groundwork for further detailed discussion.
This is Tessa Karlberg. I just want to say, I think that an identification of deficiencies, I think, would be helpful. Certainly at this time, I don't think PG&E would agree to filing a ramp amendment. As we all know, the purpose of ramp is to fix any changes to our risk analysis ahead of our 2023 GRC. So if we were to receive a list of deficiencies, we would certainly work to incorporate those and remediate those ahead of our 2023 GRC. I don't believe at this time we would have sufficient time and resources to be able to make a amended ramp filing that would be used and useful in informing our 2023 GRC application.
We appreciate that. We'd still like to have the discussion, whatever, you know, wherever this leads, because we still need to do much further analysis. I'm not saying we don't have a lot more analysis to do, but there's some things that are really striking that are coming out. So,
yeah.
And I wanted to give PG time, not only to work on it sooner rather than later, but also perhaps so that our RASA could review it and evaluate it, because that's what we are supposed to do in order to feed into the GRC2, you know, to evaluate and update rather than just us tearing it all apart. I mean, perhaps there may be a possibility that some things could be addressed, you know. So I would like to have this discussion on July 30th.
Yeah, and I hear that, Wendy, and thank you for clearing that up. So, and anything you can provide ahead of time, I think for us, obviously would help us to make sure that we're prepared. I think that's what I was just trying to say. So I think we're kind of in alignment here.
Yeah, and just to, for example, make sure that your concerns are, you know, we'll be prepared to talk about the deficiencies on July 30th. It'd be great if you could write out your concerns that you. It doesn't have to be a formal report. Something for us to help us to bring the right people to the table to talk about issues that would really help.
Okay, concerning the walkthrough on the work papers today, it looks like there are still a ton of questions that people may still have. And I agree with Ken's suggestion that we should let parties go through the work papers and further ruminate on the technicalities of it and come up with additional questions that they may have. So let's consider a possible workshop after the July 30th workshop. If we were to do that, what would be a good date for that?
What is the topic is specifically for a continued work paper discussion?
So further deep dive into the work paper discussions that we were not able to finish today. So it sounded to me like both Wendy and Tom and their experts have a lot of questions still on the work papers. And this would give them an opportunity to do a more deep dive onto the work papers after they have had further opportunity to go through those models, and they may have, it looks like they will have a lot more additional questions, follow-up questions as a result of today's discussion.
So Steve, this is Tom. I think that our questions, and I need to, I need to circle back with our consultants. We're just hearing this, in real time, and so I haven't had a chance to talk to our consultants yet. But I know that there is a concern about being able to understand how PG&E went from inputs to outputs, and we talked about that some, and we also talked in this workshop about the trying to further understand if parties want to see alternative, use alternative values, how that would work. So that could be a topic. And Steve, you mentioned you don't want that to be an offline conversation, and I'm glad you said that should be open to all. And Wendy also indicated that. So I think that could be a good topic for a further workshop. I don't know if it's if it's a full day or a half day at this point, but I like the idea of reserving time. And to your question about when, I would encourage it to be sometime. There are Wildfire Safety Division workshops that are happening in the second week of August. And then the third week of August, I'm out on vacation, so I wouldn't be ready to do that until the last week of August or later, just in terms of timing for turn.
Would it, and I think that probably falls into acceptable to us. Again, does it make sense to give people to kind of round up on this question once people are able to digest the user guide a little bit more, ask us questions, and then we can discuss availability? I know I'd want to loop back with Vincent and Yumi and support group and make sure we're prepared for that.
Okay, and then we also may be able to combine that workshop with the opportunity to do a presentation on the other risks, such as gas transmission, gas distribution, electric distribution, and electric transmission. Those have not been discussed. So that may be an opportunity to roll those risks chapters into that workshop also.
Okay, if that's what I'm hearing from this group, I think that gives me something to work with and prepare for.
Let's plan for the last week. I shouldn't say the last week. Last week is the 31st. The fourth week of well, let's plan for the week of 24th to 28th. Monday is the 24th. Friday is the 28th. Let's pick any one of those dates. I'll let you go back to discuss with your subject matter experts for their availability. Ken?
That sounds good. Yeah, that works for us.
Yeah, I would also urge parties to think about how the overall process we are going to take, right? I mean, we're not opposed to holding these workshops, but we want to make sure we get to a goal and we get to it in a reasonable period of time. So I do like to see, like the end state that we're getting to. We did talk about the workshops, but for example, we talk about running.
The goal is to afford.
Everybody knows that could be iterative. We could be running scenarios for a really long time. As you see one scenario, another more scenarios and things like that. But I think we need to make sure that we've put a cap on what this process looks like, so everybody understands where we're heading.
I think, Vincent, I think we have a good plan. I think we'll go into the workshop on the 30th. I think we will wait for questions from people and hopefully answer them in a public sphere. Right. So if people ask us questions, we'll make it available so everyone can see the answers, and hopefully that helps everybody. If necessary, we'll hold that workshop on the 24th to continue this work paper discussion, and if not, to address the electric and gas risks there. So I think that's our path forward is what I heard.
Yeah, so I would like to have some clarity on a firm date by August 3rd. That way, that will give me sufficient time to do a public notice.
Noted. We will let you know.
Okay.
I would appreciate it if we could think about beginning August 26th as opposed to 24th, just because coming back from vacation, I need then time to talk to my experts and, you know, understand what we're going to be, how we're going to participate in the workshop.
Okay, I hear you.
Okay. With all that said, should we wrap up for today?
I think that's right. Steve, we appreciate Safety Policy Division hosting, and we appreciate all the participants and the feedback we heard today, and we have some more workshops on the horizon, so we'll be working with people here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend. Goodbye.
Thanks.